Good morning and welcome to Unit 12. We are approaching the end of our class, and I wanted to thank you so much for your great reflections last week on Jamaica Kincaid's short story, short fiction, Girl. And one of the things I really appreciated was when you were writing comments for this particular short fiction, that you were reflecting on past short stories and actually coming up with some amazing connections between um, James Thurber's Secret Life of Walter Mitty. You were talking about all of these great connections between even the yellow wallpaper or A Good Man is Hard to Find. You were thinking about all kinds of connections across these texts and characters, and I thought that was really helpful to think about this short fiction not existing in isolation, but actually we're seeing echoes and repetitions of all of these characters, of these motifs in the fiction that we've read. For example, we were talking about how everyday use, mama, sort of reflects in the voice of the short fiction. And I wanted to point out, a lot of you were having questions about, the sort of the kind of literal disclaimer of like calling this girl a slut over and over again. And so I think something worth noting is that Jamaica Kincaid, and this is an excerpt I've included in our Unit 12 folder, is actually talking about, she was actually questioned, she said, is this about you? Is this about getting advice from your mother? Did you take your mother's advice? She said, no, because I had other ideas of how to be a self-possessed woman. I didn't know that at the time. I only remember these things. What the mother in the story sees as aids to living in the world, the girl might see as extraordinary oppression, which is one of the things I came to see. On another level, however, she says, almost like she's Mother England. I was just going to say that I've come to see that I work through the relationship of the mother and the girl to a relationship between Europe and the place that I'm from, Antigua, which is to say a relationship between the powerful and the powerless. The girl is powerless and the mother is powerful. The mother shows her how to be in the world, but at the back of her mind, she thinks she never will get it. She's deeply skeptical that this child could ever grow up to be a self-possessed woman, and in the end, she reveals her skepticism. Yet even within the skepticism is, of course, dismissal and scorn. So it's not unlike the relationship between the conquered and the conqueror. So Antigua in the 1600s was actually a British settlement. So I think that was a really interesting explanation of, so on the one level, we're kind of trying to understand the short story as a relationship between a mother and her daughter, but at the same time, perhaps it's also symptomatic of a kind of metaphor, right? A sort of analogy of something greater going on, a kind of allegory of sorts. So just a few comments I wanted to highlight. Thank you, Michael, for noting that you were a little bit reminded of A Good Man is Hard to Find, especially in the character. I think you had said it later of the grandmother. This line you noted, be sure to wash every day, even if it's with your own spit. Don't squat down to play marbles. You're not a boy, you know. This specifically reminds me, you said, of Mama from A Good Man is Hard to Find. And I've never seen the acronym before, but I love it because it's such a long title. And because of how raw it is, while it may seem terrible to wash yourself with your own spit, she's showing how important it is to clean yourself as a woman. This has a connection because of how Mama was with the girls in the story. She tried her best to provide them truth and insight on how to carry themselves. And actually also in everyday use. And Michaela, you made this connection. You said that, this part reminds you of something Mama would teach Maggie and Dee would not know how to do in everyday use. So soak your clothes right after you take them off. And when buying cotton, make sure you yourself a nice blouse. Be sure that it doesn't have gum in it because that way it won't hold up after a wash. And Kristen, you said, yes, I totally agree. And Alexia, you too, the first thing that came up to your head too, and in your head too, and you said, I pictured that's how Loiselle had to work in the necklace after she lost the real one. So connections to the necklace here. And then there's also a connection you guys are making to the yellow wallpaper and Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Jake, you were spot on when you pointed out that this part right here in the text, this is how to bully a man. You said this phrase reminds me of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Walter's wife bullied him constantly. Absolutely. I'm sorry, that was Jen. And then Jake, you said it. I thought that was really interesting, and it hadn't come to mind that this can be related to The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. This is one of my favorite short stories, and I'm glad someone related back to that story. So thank you, Jen, for pointing that out, and Jake for the reply. Um, and then one other comment, Jake, you said, also connecting part of this text to the yellow wallpaper. I also found it very interesting that this was included in the story, the ways, the sort of dynamic between the male-female relationship, especially in marriage. Although in this particular relationship, it's sort of prior to marriage, it's sort of leading up to that kind of courting. So those are just some of the brief highlights, and I wanted to let you know, thank you, I think it was to Kristen who in the Google slide deck pointed out, thinking about short fiction and its ability to really condense and importantly frame specific language in a very specific kind of articulation. Pointed out that the semicolons in this list really continue. There's like this continuity between this list, right? So it's really just what we're reading here is a really long list of items about how to be, how to act, a kind of how to act with specific conventions as a female. In the medieval period, this would be considered something called conduct literature. In addition to some medieval conduct literature, I think that Kristen pointed out there's a story that reminds her of a book from earlier called Rules for Being a Girl by Candace Bushnell and Katie Katungo. You said the main character in the book publishes the unwritten rules that girls are expected to follow in order to be perceived as good, and the concept in this line really brings up a scene in the book. So thanks for making that connection both within the text and outside, exterior to the text. That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing, Kristen. A freely accessible article that some of you might be interested in reading is called Genre Crossing in Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, From Short Fiction to Poetry. And it's a really excellent article that examines the ways in which, we're trying to designate specific literature as a particular genre. So short fiction as opposed to short fiction, as opposed to poetry or the novel. And so this particular Reem Ahmed Rabea and Nusaiba Adel Alamah Hamid discuss the ways in which Girl reveals its poetic nature for being thoroughly repetitive and alliterative. So the poetic nature of this particular text. And one of the things I thought was interesting was the analysis that they do in terms of the repetitions of this. Later throughout this document, there's an analysis of the kinds of alliterative patterns, alliterative referring to the repetition of consonant sounds. So way, won't, well, wash, and water. Soak, salt, Sunday, school, such, someone, and stomach. There's this sort of rhythmic pattern in a lot of this language, and it's very carefully interwoven. So there's alliteration. Later they'll talk a little bit about different features of the writing. For example, over here there's something called euphony, which I actually haven't heard before. Euphony, what they define as pleasing combinations of the sounds of language, which is kind of vague, but so this is how you sweep a corner, and I guess the authors suggest that sounds like sweep, to, and u, and semivowels like s, y, and w are exquisitely used. So if you're really interested in kind of learning how Jamaica Kincaid kind of bends genres and sort of transgresses the boundaries of what exactly short fiction is, what exactly poetry is, this would be an excellent article to look up, and I will link this under our Unit 11 folder. For our last unit, Unit 12, I wanted to end our class because you've done such a great job of thinking through James Thurber, thinking through Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and especially Flannery O'Connor, all writers who also have dabbled in and were really interested in art, in ways of expressing some of their language, some of their story in a graphic form. And so you were comparing pictures or archival materials or sketches or cartoons, and I wanted to think about how a short story actually was driven by the images rather than sort of by text alone. And so to do that, we're going to be ending with an examination of Linda Berry's graphic short fiction called Two Questions. So Linda Berry was actually born in Wisconsin, and she became an art student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. In college, Berry considered herself a hippie, and she struck up a friendship with a fellow student, Matt Groening, who later created the television series The Simpsons. Groening was the editor of the college newspaper, and Berry became a contributor, starting, quote, to do cartoons, and it was mainly for Matt, end quote, who thought she had a terrific sense of humor. So since then, she's been highly successful with her comics, published widely. Berry's early work, Drawn with a Pen, has a new wave 1980s look, but after she hurt her wrist, she gave up the pen for a brush, which gave her drawings their characteristically loose, childlike appearance. Thinking back to James Thurber, who's losing his eyesight and sort of changed the way he drew as well. Then as an alternative, weeklies fell victim to corporate acquisitions and mergers. So her publications kind of faltered, and so she's been doing small comics in Montreal. And currently, most recently, I should point out, I'm going to link this particular publication, was granted the Macarthur Genius Fellowship in February of 2020. And so there's a 34-minute listen, but I've included just a 3-minute introduction of Linda Berry to you. And so it kind of describes her artwork, her process, and talks about what she's doing now. So right now she's an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin. Her latest book is sort of an illustrated guide on how to create comics. So she's really interested in helping others and teaching others about what kind of artwork she does and how others can achieve sort of empower them to be creative. So this week, I urge you to begin by meeting Linda Berry. Her short 3-minute video on her work is going to kind of set you off and set you up nicely for the remaining activities, which are to look at and actually examine this graphic short fiction story called Two Questions. And what I'd like you to do this week is, as you're reading, your impulses are excellent for like what to do and how to think through these things. Please leave at least 2 comments that address anything that is striking about this particular genre. What do you make of the graphics, the narration? Is it something we've seen before? Is it totally new? How and why? And so please leave at least 2 comments and 2 peer replies by Friday. The next thing I'd like you to do is, in this Google slide deck, I'm only asking that you reflect on your work in this class so far. What are the takeaways for you in this class? Which short stories in our units did you most enjoy? And what do you want to learn more about? And again, thinking about our course objectives to help frame some of those responses to this particular slide deck entry. And finally, I'm really excited to describe to you this graphic short fiction activity discussion board. So what I'd like you to do this week as your sort of centerpiece for your own creative work is to think about the 2 questions that the narrator asks in this short fiction. Is this good, and does this suck? The short story reflects on how the pressures, expectations, and stereotypes of being a female artist weigh on Berry as a character in these comics, but also how she overcomes these pressures and takes ownership of her creativity. What I'd like you to do in our final Google Slide discussion board post is to reflect on our past readings, just as you did last week. I want you to choose any character from those short stories in the past and imagine what 2 questions that character may have encountered in his or her youth. And again, the 2 questions should be like the same side of the sort of about the same kind of topic. So is this good? Does this suck? And both of those questions are about her creative ability, her ability to draw. What I would like you to do is illustrate a very short graphic story of these 2 questions using this free platform called Storyboard That. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. You don't even have to create an account. It's this really great, I kind of experimented. I'll show you what I created. There's this great menu that allows you to choose scenes, characters, shapes, infographics. You can change, anything that you want around in these 3 spaces. And I'd like you to create just a very short story about 2 questions that a particular character that we've read before has or might ask. So the first thing that you'd want to do is think about a character you'd like to revisit. And then I'd like you to think about, imagine what 2 questions this character may have encountered in his or her youth or adulthood. And again, those two questions should mimic what Linda Berry is doing here. Is this good? Does this suck? It has to do with her ability to achieve something. As you work through this storyboard, when you get finished, what all I want you to do is take a screenshot and post this to your Google Site page. Along with this short storyboard, I'd like you to answer these questions 2 and 3 at the bottom here and leave 4 peer replies by Friday. I'll be leaving you a final comment about midweek, and I look forward to your responses this week. Thank you so much.